I've been mentioning for years how SCUD The Disposable Assassin changed my life, and in this video I'm going to finally explain that to people. This series started in 1994, and leading up to that I was reading primarily Marvel Comics, mostly Amazing Spider-Man, and Image Comics launched and I jumped over to that. Image was basically everything that 12-year-old version of me wanted out of comics, and in hindsight, sure, some of that was trying to replicate what those creators were doing at Marvel prior to the founding of Image, but there was a harder edge to everything, and certainly the fact that those weren't approved by the Comics Code was, sort of like that explicit sticker that was on CDs at the time. Like it was almost like an R-rated movie. It felt like something that I shouldn't be experiencing, but it was exactly what I wanted. I'll explain this too. There was mostly one comic shop in the town that I was in, but further away there were two other good ones, I would say better ones. The one that I was going to primarily on a weekly basis, my mother was also buying comics, otherwise there was no way that I was going. It was too far away to get there on my bike, but it was over by Galaxy World for anyone that's super local, and for literally everyone else, it was our local arcade / bowling alley. But this comic shop was a combination comics and sports cards. So like the comics that they had were all the mainstream. Again, it was Marvel, DC, Image. They didn't have anything like SCUD. For that, I had to go to one of the other comic shops, the dedicated comic shops. And one fateful day in 1994, I went to Graham Crackers. This is over by the mall, so this is about 20 minutes drive from my house. I went to Graham Crackers, and one of the employees there stuck this in my hand. He saw me just wandering around, and he stuck an issue of SCUD in my hand, and literally everything changed after that. I flipped through it real quick. It was just black and white. I'll show you this whole thing is black and white. And it just looked like insanity. So I can show you this here. Like there's a plug head monster with mouths for knees, and he quotes movie lines or song lines. Like everything he says is a quote, and I keep saying he even though he is actually a she. Her name is Jeff. But that changed everything. I'd never seen anything like that, and even the TV that we were watching at the time was safe. We didn't have cable. We only had one TV at the time. Whatever my sister and I were watching, it was whatever our mother was watching. So it was, Star Trek: The Next Generation. It was safe and clean, and I hated it. I felt a need for something else, and SCUD was eventually that missing piece for me. I'm basically saying it was a very safe, controlled environment that I grew up in, and I was too young to really have a job. I had some money. I spent that money on comics. So the few comics that I had, I continually reread to keep myself entertained. All of those early issues I have fairly well memorized just because I read them so many times back in the 90s. I don't do that anymore, and I haven't done that for a long time. Basically, since getting a job and a car, those two events, I've been trying to experience as wide a range of entertainment as I can. So movies, TV, music. Basically, it's a combination of trying to catch up on things that I knew I was missing. Because even though I didn't have cable, I wasn't watching R-rated movies, that type of thing, I still knew that they existed. I was going to school. My grandmother had cable, and we were out there once a week, so I'd watch a little bit of Nickelodeon on a weekly basis. It's just, I wasn't ingesting any of it consistently enough, and I knew that I was missing out on things. And since getting access to money from working and my own car to be able to go where I want, to do the things that I want, I've been trying to essentially catch up on things that I knew I was missing and experience as wide a range of things, as I said, as I possibly could. So it's rare for me to rewatch TV or movies. It's also rare for me to reread comics that I've already read. Basically, I'm entertained for however long the thing exists, or I learn whatever lesson is intended to be learned, and I move on to the next thing. Like I said, I'm trying to experience as much as I can. But in those early days, I reread all of my comics on a regular basis. It is possible, if SCUD weren't what that comic shop employee put into my hand that day, that it would have eventually been something else. Like I've said, as soon as I got a car and money, this same thing may have happened. But really, SCUD for me it's a defining moment in my life, and I wish I knew who that employee was so I could thank them. But it is what started me down the road of searching out new things. This was very small press. This was SCUD The Disposable Assassin was put on by Fireman Press originally. This is done by Image, and there's a very nice story here in the beginning, written by Rob Schrab's wife, about sort of the creation and the history of SCUD, the creation of the final 4 issues. Unlike a lot of the books that are in this room, things that I bought years ago, and I did buy this a very long time ago, and I didn't read it. Unlike those other books, this is something that I was intentionally avoiding. 20 issues of the series were put out between 1994 and 1998, and it ends on a cliffhanger. There were also a couple of spin-off books and one-shots, but 20 issues of SCUD The Disposable Assassin were put out, and the series ends on what's kind of a cliffhanger, but it's really just an absolute downer of a moment. And when this was put out, this is 2008, when the final 4 issues came out, so 10 years later, I wasn't buying comics at the time. I sort of knew that it existed because I was still following comic news at the time. I just wasn't buying comics. And so I knew that it existed, and I was happy. And as soon as the collection came out, I bought it, and then sat on it. And the only reason that I can give for that is the series held such an importance to me, so much meaning, that I didn't want it to be over. As long as those 4 issues still existed, unread by me, then they were still in my future. They were something that I was looking forward to eventually reading. But as soon as I read those, they would be in my past and it would be over. Like, at that point, the series would really and truly be over, even though to the rest of the planet it was. For me, it was something that I was still looking forward to doing. It's not that sometimes I avoid something just because I think it's going to be terrible, and so I avoid it, but that's not the case here. I didn't expect those issues to be terrible, and thankfully they weren't. As irrational as it sounds, I just didn't want to read them because I didn't want the series to be over. I was having a conversation about a month ago, and I can't remember what the original title was, but basically the argument was, if you didn't experience it at the time, so in this case it was in the 80s, but if you didn't experience it at the time, then trying to get into it later wasn't going to work. So if you had experienced it in the 80s, then you were a fan, and if you tried to get into it later, you wouldn't be. You just wouldn't understand it. And in that conversation, there were 2 other titles referenced. One was Buckaroo Banzai, and the other was Big Trouble in Little China. And I find Big Trouble in Little China difficult to grasp, because I didn't watch that until, I think, the 2000s. And I'm still a huge fan of that movie. But Buckaroo Banzai, I kind of get the possibility. SCUD might be another example of that. I don't know if someone coming into this fresh from the modern era would get as much out of this series, certainly as much enjoyment out of it as I did, and now rereading it still do, because I got into it in the 90s, and there's certainly a nostalgia factor, but I don't know. But I think the argument makes more sense to me now than it did back at the time. I did notice some spelling mistakes, so it's that sort of thing that people might be turned off by. I know there are 2 instances where the word loose is used instead of lose, but there are others where words are just missing letters. For anyone unfamiliar, I just want to just picture Rob. For anyone unfamiliar, I want to just run through sort of the first issue. So, Scud is an assassin that comes out of a vending machine. Already, I love this idea. So he is hired, and here's what he looks like, obviously, from the cover as well. He's hired to kill this Jeff the Plughead monster, who I was talking about before. She has mouths for knees, but she's a combination of a plughead and a squid, and her appendages can be replaced as needed because they get torn off. So Scud is fighting her, and he realizes after getting sprayed in the face by ink, he goes into the bathroom to clean himself off, and it notices this sign. This unit will self-destruct upon termination of the target. So he realizes that he's going to die if he carries out this mission of killing Jeff. And so at that point, it becomes an issue of... There she is, losing her limbs. It's pretty violent. It becomes an issue of... The series at that point really becomes an issue of trying to keep her alive and contained so that he himself doesn't die. And we get some great imagery. So at that point, Scud puts Jeff into a hospital, and he needs to earn money to pay her hospital bills. We get all of the rest of this based on that first issue, and it is insane the places that this book goes. So here is one of the things. This is Ben Franklin, only here he goes by Voodoo Ben because he is sort of a thing for zombies. And there are multiple instances of zombie dinosaurs in this, which I absolutely love. There's another shot of that with an Atari logo on his belly. There's also a lot of moments like this. Tommy Bartlett's Robot World. This is a postcard that he's sending to his mob friends. But Tommy Bartlett Robot World is something that I don't know how far this extends. It's a Wisconsin Dells thing, and certainly we were getting commercials for it here in the Chicago suburbs, but I don't know how far the reach of this went, and it's just one of those local things that I love, because it injects a bit of realism. It's kind of an inside joke, but it's stuff like this, just like visual humor, that reminds me of some of the stuff Rob Guillory was doing on Chew, or Chip Zdarsky on Sex Criminals. It's this kind of stuff always. I love it. I appreciate it. I love it. At one point, Scud is in a pretty brutal fight, winds up losing an arm. So he goes to a mechanic to get a replacement arm, and he winds up getting a loner. So here Scud is after just giving a sandwich to the arm to feed it. But it turns out the arm was part werewolf. And we're only up to, I think by this point, that's only the first 6 issues. Like, just insanity. Like I said, I absolutely loved every second of it. Here we have Pavlov, who has a dog for a head. We've got basically a Smothers Brothers reference, who, again, I was watching them on TV as a kid, and it's another one of those things. I don't know how many other people did, but I think about the Smothers Brothers pretty regularly. And what's weird is there are multiple uses of yo-yos as weapons. Like, it feels like Rob was also sort of a fan, or if not a fan, at least watching the Smothers Brothers. But it's this kind of thing where I'm thinking, it reminds me of The Tick at sort of the bizarre world, the bizarre enemies, characters that he would go up against and encounter. In issue 7, we get Drywall for the first time. Drywall is a character that I absolutely love. There is a solo issue about Drywall's origin in here that was really sort of one of the first gut punch moments for me reading comics. Here on the opposite page is Drywall in action. He's got zippers and hands. This is the latest fight. I think we're on issue, I don't know, 9, maybe 8, 9. But Jeff has returned. She has replaced one arm with a laser cannon, and a horse has replaced the other arm. And here, Scud has outfitted himself with some nunchucks and a rifle. They are fighting currently inside of Drywall, who has all of these storage bins inside of him. Here we have Oswald, who is the previous version of Scud. He kind of looks like a robot. I mean, a rabbit. Oswald. And over here, we get Susudio, who will eventually become Scud's love interest. So by this point, we are about halfway through. And it's essentially just random adventures. Like I said, there is an overall storyline of Scud trying to earn money so that he can pay Jeff's hospital bills, but it is pretty much, here we have Dan Harmon, who co-wrote some of the issues. It is essentially just the most random adventures. There is a continuity to it. So here we have the return of Voodoo Ben, but it isn't until those final 4 issues where things really get a direction story-wise. Everything escalates until we get to this point. This is issue 16, where there is Voodoo Ben on one side and an army of undead creatures. They're actually fighting in a zoo at the time, and sort of the military. And people want Scud and or Jeff for a variety of reasons, but it gets to this point where there is just a massive fight between these two incredible forces, and then everything stops. We get to this point where there is a horse, Scud and Susudio, and everything around them has stopped, and time has paused. And I wonder at this point if Rob sort of wrote himself into a corner with this story of this war, essentially, between these two factions, until he got to this point and he's like, screw it, I'm gonna have some more random adventures. Because that's what happens at that point, is they get on this horse and then are teleported to different places, and it almost becomes at that point like Quantum Leap. They get taken to a place, they do something, the horse reappears, they get on and are taken somewhere new. Issue 17 is super memorable to me. This is, we're getting real close to the final 90s issues, but there is a point, so they're sort of teleported to this medieval-ish town, and they walk into a bar. There's this sign here, and I don't know how many of you have sort of inside jokes or inside references that are so inside that you don't even speak them out loud just because you know no one else would get them, but this is one of those moments for me. So him and Studio walk into this bar. There's this sign here, and the bartender tells them that Scud needs to leave, and he says this, that he's actually in cursed armor, questing for the Ring of Ogres, the only object in the Northern Realms that can remove the rune of Gandalf. And the bartender accepts this, and Susudio asks him about it, and he says it was 1/3 Tolkien, 1/3 Zeppelin, 1/3 horseshit. And you can see there's a misspelling of Zeppelin, but this is one of those things that has forever stuck in my head that I've just loved, but I think about this probably every few months for the last almost 25 years, and it's one of these things that I could never tell anyone because I didn't think anyone else would ever get it. But 1/3 Tolkien, 1/3 Zeppelin, 1/3 horseshit. It's one of those things that I just love, and it has lived in my head for, like I said, almost 25 years. I'm going to skip ahead down to issue 20, which was the final issue put out in the 90s before the series went on hiatus for 10 years, and Rob went off to Hollywood to write and direct and generally be successful. Couldn't be happier for him, but as a fan of the comic, it was a rough period to go through. But anyway, they're once again on the horse, and they wind up in heaven. And things have escalated from that zombie military war to heaven and hell have taken sides, and they both want something from SCUD. While there, things do not go well for either of them. And that's how things ended for a very long time, until, according to the forward, Eric Stevenson reached out to Rob asking to finish the series and to do a collection. And he thought he could do it in less pages, and it ultimately wound up being 4 issues of material. Those 4 issues, so I've talked about the random adventures that SCUD has been on, SCUD and Studio, Drywall, Oswald, all of them. There's a definite direction in those 4 issues. Things get worse. Things get much worse, honestly. But there's a definite drive to the story that wasn't present in the rest of this, and it's appreciated, really. I'm all for random adventures, but when you're wrapping up a story, it wraps things up extremely well, and I was afraid right up until the very end, because it didn't seem like things had enough time to resolve based on how bad things got. But it ends extremely well. I'm very happy that I've not only read this, but that Rob finished this. And again, this happened years ago. At this point, it's 12 plus years ago, but I was having a random conversation about SCUD. I think this was back in early December, and really from that point on, I knew that I had to read this pretty soon, that I knew it was finally going to happen, and I continued to put it off for at least a month. But I've recently had additional time on my hands, and I knew that now would be the best time to do it. So I finally read it. I finished this in under 24 hours. I read the entire thing basically in 2 sittings and loved every second of it. Loved rereading the original material, and especially loved the 4-issue conclusion to this. I absolutely recommend it. Like I said, this was put out in 2008, so availability might be spotty. If you can find it, I absolutely recommend it. As I've said, this series changed the course of my life, in my opinion. I can't say that it will do the same thing for you, but it had a huge impact on my life. I am forever grateful to Rob, to SCUD, to whoever else worked on this with him, to Fireman Press, to literally everyone involved, including that comic shop employee. Yes, I recommend it, despite what I said at the beginning about possibly not working for modern audiences, but it is really good. And I think for the possibly minority of people that are going to love it, that are going to truly love it, not just like it. I think this is probably going to be one of those where you either love it or hate it, but for those that love it, I think they're truly going to love it. As always, thanks for watching.